My intention was never to cheat, but I knew I was in deep trouble the moment I opened the back door and saw him standing there, drenched in perspiration and smiling as if he knew every naughty idea that had ever crossed my mind. It began normally on a Tuesday. While my husband John was in one of his interminable meetings at work, I sat around the house doing nothing more than drinking iced coffee and checking my phone. I was half annoyed and half involved as I stepped out to the patio in my robe and sunglasses an hour before the scheduled arrival of pool guy Ethan, who was due to arrive in the afternoon. Ethan appeared as though he belonged on a fragrance billboard. He was young, perhaps in his early 20s, and had that effortless, natural confidence. As he dragged himself out of the pool, his tan arms stretched and his sun-streaked hair was slightly untidy. I didn't even bother to inquire as to his purpose in the water because I was too preoccupied watching. He apologized to Ms. Parker while rinsing his hair of water. The filter was clogged, so I had to get in. There was none remorse on his part. He seemed to be waiting for a response as he stood there, arms crossed over his big chest. I handed him one, too, damn it. To emphasize that I wasn't your average suburban housewife lazing about, I slid my robe slightly off my shoulder. "Seems like you handled it," I remarked in a smooth, casual tone. To make sure he saw the silk on my robe and the way the sunbeams brushed on my skin, I leaned against the doorframe. He gave a subtle nod, but he had lost interest in the pool. "Yes, I am just about to wrap up." Due to the stress he was under at work, John had become emotionally distant and no longer acknowledged me. This had persisted for months. Everything I did, from buying him new underwear to treating him to expensive dinners and even acting engaged during our business meetings, had no effect. And suddenly Ethan stood so near that I could almost smell the chlorine on his skin. His gaze lingered over me as if he were seeing something that John had long since ignored. It seemed wrong to me. It seemed like the right thing to do: close the door, go inside, and act if nothing had occurred. But that was not the case for me. I remained there, my temperature increasing, my pulse racing, and I felt more energized than in years. "Can I get you something to drink?" I asked despite the fact that my mind was screaming at me to stop. A wide grin spread across Ethan's face. "No problem at all. Water is perfectly great." I turned around, adjusting the sway of my robe just so, before entering. His bare feet tapped against the tile floor as he followed. As I poured his cup, my fingers quivered a little. Then, as I gave it to him, ours brushed. The combination of the electric shock and the pinpoint contact almost made me faint. He leaned against the counter and spoke in a manner that caused my stomach to knot up. "I hope you're doing well." I felt a rush of excitement since his query was so smooth and low-key, as if he genuinely wanted to know the answer. "Now it's better," I confessed, speaking more softly than I had planned. He placed the glass on the table, his gaze fixed on me the whole time. "I see." With a heavy heart, I forced myself to swallow. "Yeah." Our distance from one another narrowed. A dense fog rolled in. As his fingers brushed a strand of hair off my face, I could sense my own breath racing. He reached up to touch me. The kind of stress that builds up and doesn't let go is intolerable. Then it broke. As soon as it happened, there was no turning back. Leaning in just the right amount, he could sense my desires before I could control myself. The sound of a door opening could then be heard coming from outside the home. At home, John was getting up early. The door swung open just as I was about to take a step back. Casual and unaware, John's voice echoed throughout the home. "My darling?" Ethan stood up straight and moved away from the counter as if the physical proximity hadn't caused my heart rate to spike. I snatched the dish towel that was closest to me and wasted a hand wiping the counter while trying to seem cool, but in fact I was everything but. "This way." My pulse racing, I dialed the number again. Almost immediately after, John stepped into the foyer, his tie somewhat loose and his hair rather untidy, as if he had been playing with it all day. His brows furrowed slightly in perplexion as he glanced at Ethan and then at me. "I didn't expect you to be here," John remarked, casting a glance at Ethan. "Is the pool in good working order?" Ethan gave an unreadable nod. "Okay, I've just finished." As John let out a long breath, he set his briefcase down on the counter. "I may go for a swim later. The heat has been unbearable. The weight of Ethan's presence behind me, the dense unspoken tension between us, I faked a grin, but it was all in vain. I coiled my fingers around the dish towel as if it were my sole means of self-preservation. "Is it okay if I go have a drink of water before I go?" Ethan inquired, and I sprang into action to fetch a glass for him before John had a chance to answer. Something to occupy my hands and keep my mind from wandering. Affecting his neck, John massaged it. "Of course, dude. Please, get some help for yourself." I was very cautious not to touch our fingers when I passed the water to Ethan. I averted my gaze from his eyes for a moment before John picked up on the intensity of my face. As my husband, Ethan, took a long drink, his Adam's apple jiggling as he swallowed, I shifted my focus to him. "You go home early because of what?" With an entirely impartial tone, I inquired. Heaved a sigh, John. "We had to cancel the meeting. Just thought I'd head home and see if I can get anything done." I felt queasy. Work. That's his default setting, his top priority. He still felt the need to immediately dive headfirst into additional work if he had an unanticipated day off. After finishing his drink, Ethan set his glass on the counter and nodded to John. "Perfect. I will move aside so you don't have to. It appears that the pool is in good working order. Feel free to inform me if anything else is required." John casually waved a hand. "Sure, I'll be happy to help." I led Ethan to the door, and for an instant, while John swung around to search the refrigerator, Ethan's fingertips lightly touched mine. I felt a chill run down my spine from the intense heat of that one touch. My heart was pounding and my mind was racing as he silently left, leaving me to stand there. Nothing was noticed by John. I remember lying in bed with my spouse that night, staring up at the ceiling while he gently slept next to me. The afternoon's tension, the almost, the unspoken, was still resonating in my body. Furthermore, I was fully aware that this was far from over. Absolutely not. As was his custom the following morning, John departed early. His mind was likely already elsewhere, engrossed in emails and meetings, as he kissed my cheek absent-mindedly before he drove away. As his car drove away down the street, I saw it from the window. Even though nothing had transpired yet, my heart was beating and my fingers twitched as they brushed against the coffee cup. Even though it wasn't supposed to, something would happen. I sensed it. I pretended to tidy all morning, but in reality, all I did was wait. The sun had already risen as the pool gate swung wide, illuminating the ripples in the water with its brilliant reflections. While Ethan stood at the edge of the terrace, inspecting the skimmer basket, I stepped upon it. His slightly curled lips informed me he wasn't startled to see me there as he peered up at me. "Good morning," I murmured, my voice more refined than necessary. When I asked him how Mrs. Parker was doing this morning, he responded with a playful lilt that made my stomach knot. I moved closer, my arms crossed over my chest in a relaxed position. I never expected to have to schedule another cleaning so quickly. With a smile on his face, he shrugged. "Checking to see whether everything is operational." The tension between us had been constant. There it had been, waiting, seething beneath the surface. After John departed, there was no longer any means to prevent it from resurfacing. My heart raced as I forced myself to swallow. In hindsight, I should have gone home. There was something else I should have done, gone inside, contacted a buddy, etc. However, as if contemplating something, I allowed my fingers to trace the edge of the pool chair that was adjacent to me. "Is that your only purpose for coming here?" Slowly and deliberately, Ethan advanced. I gasped for air. "No," he whispered under his breath. I could feel the distance between us narrowing as my body reacted even before my thoughts could intervene. A subtle chlorine aroma blended with another, uniquely his aroma. As he raised his hand, he delicately ran his fingertips over my wrist. He said I shouldn't be here, but he remained put. Even though I knew he wouldn't, I still dared him to go. He drew in his pupils and breathed more shallowly. Avoid that at all costs. Then again, he was correct. Not me. Absolutely not. In an instant, the tension was released, and I found myself in his presence, my fingers entwined in his damp hair, and his hands firmly clutching my waist, as if he had been anticipating this moment for as long as I had. As my heart pounded against my ribs, I felt a tightening in my breath. A caution bell went off in the recesses of my mind. But at that point, I didn't care. It was already late. I was still trying to process what had just transpired, and the only sound that could be heard between us was the hum of the pool filter. Ethan maintained a strong grasp on my waist as his touch penetrated the delicate fabric of my robe. I ought to have distanced myself, I ought to have terminated things here. But that was not the case for me. Rather, I raised my eyes to meet his, and the intensity of his stare gave me a second surge. A dangerous and exciting sensation like a fire was raging in my chest. I mumbled something about how we shouldn't, but I remained where I was. He also didn't. Indeed, Ethan concurred, his voice low and harsh. We have not been deterred by it, though. He leaned in and made me feel totally subservient by tracing his fingertips down my jaw and tilting my chin ever so slightly. As he moved in again, my pulse raced, and for an instant I allowed myself to be swept away by the passionate, slow-moving kiss between our lips. Outside, a vehicle door banged. My breath caught in my throat as I jerked back. Ethan's expression turned reserved and controlled as he briefly tightened his grip on me before releasing me. "Hello, John." I was overcome with panic. His expected arrival home was still a ways off. As I repositioned my robe, my hands quivered in an effort to conceal the shame that was clearly visible on my face. As if he were about to wrap up his task, Ethan stepped back and reached for the skimmer net. He excelled in this area. Way too good. He showed no signs of being frightened. At the same time, the rush of adrenaline was making my whole body tremble. The sound of John's voice echoed throughout the home as the front door swung open. "My darling?" I swallowed the lump in my throat and forced myself to breathe as I approached the threshold. "This way." As John made his way out onto the terrace, Ethan averted his gaze from me. Because he was so absorbed in me, my husband hardly looked at him. I spoke in a casual tone, pretending not to be burdened by my own treachery, and I stated that I didn't anticipate seeing you home so soon. "Yeah." John rubbed his forehead and let out a sigh. "We had to cancel the meeting. I figured I'd go home and relax for a while." His gaze shifted to Ethan. "Is the pool in decent condition?" A composed and businesslike Ethan nodded. "Good to go. Doing one last check." After giving me a short kiss on the temple, John walked up to me and growled to show his approval. It was strange, more like a romantic recollection than anything actual. Despite feeling sick to my stomach, I mustered up a smile. Taking hold of his backpack, Ethan placed his tools aside. "Allow me to move out of your path." With a disinterested wave, John began to make his way toward the lounge chair. Enormous anxiety continued to grip me as I escorted Ethan to the side gate. Upon arriving, he shifted his attention to me, his eyes darting across my face as if he could read me like a book. In subsequent moments, he whispered with an implied promise in his voice. Nodding, I choked to death. "Yeah." After he departed, I remained standing there, burdened by the gravity of my recent actions and aware that this was far from finished. What followed were intolerable days. Whenever I was in John's company, it seemed as if I were being interrogated or tested. He appeared innocent. No one ever gave him an excuse to be. My anxiety was over the roof because I couldn't stop thinking about Ethan, our past, and the irresistible pull that remained. Ethan remained distant. Whenever he had to stop by, he did it without loitering or making idle chatter because John was around. However, everything changed when he wasn't. We'd exchange hushed looks and a few touches here and there, but those intense, brief moments would tingle my skin for days after they ended. Everything shifted after John made a statement. Over dinner one night, he mentioned that he was considering taking a vacation. 1 or 2 weeks. So close. My fork was about to fall to the floor. "You? Going on vacation?" To hide the dread that was building up in my gut, I stifled a laugh. An unprecedented occurrence. I shrugged. "John. Indeed, I am in need of it. Get it for us." As our gazes locked, I finally noticed something after months of looking away. A glimmer of the man I had adored, the one I could never fathom betraying. I was shackled by guilt. I ought to have been relieved. My husband's desire to prioritize us should have made me pleased. But I couldn't stop thinking about how this meant we would no longer have secret meetings or Ethan. That conclusion was more devastating than it needed to be. As soon as it was light outside the following morning, I sat outside and watched Ethan methodically skim the pool. Despite his lack of acknowledgement, he was aware that I was present. I sensed it. I drew a long breath and approached him. This must end. I knew. I had to say it, but the words came out forced and hurried. Ethan pivoted, his face betraying his emotions. Is that it? Yes, this. As I felt the burden of my own choice weighing down on my chest, I made a gesture that went between us. John will be away for a while. Is he planning to renew contact? Although Ethan's jaw clenched, he slowly nodded in agreement. Is it the end? Hardly did I swallow. No other option. His dark, impenetrable eyes scrutinized me as he studied. Is it really your desire? Yes, I did nod nevertheless. Yes. He was silent for an extended period of time. He retreated a step, providing the necessary but unwanted distance for me. Very well. With a racing heart and a lump in my throat, I got up and was about to go, but his voice cut me off. If it matters, I wasn't idling away my time. I waited for his words to sink in before opening my eyes and going inside. After that, John tried for 2 weeks. Things that were once familiar but now felt strange, such as dinners, chats, and touches. I, too, tried to persuade myself that this was the solution I had been seeking, that I could finally escape Ethan's shadow and return to my previous life. The problem is that once something is broken, it can never be repaired in the same way. As for me, I wasn't entirely certain that I wanted them to be. I had worked very hard to pass the test that was John's vacation. So I went out to supper with him. In response to his comments about the office, I grinned. His jokes made me chuckle. Behaviors that I used to engage in mindlessly. However, from that point on, it seemed like I was constantly putting on an act, pretending to be someone I wasn't. And the worst thing? It was his observation. Sitting on the terrace with a glass of wine and the moon shining in the pool, John casually said that you've been acting differently as of late. From a distance, I twisted the wine in my glass while feigning a smile. I've simply been exhausted. Work, home, and everything in between. Before nodding, he looked at me intently for a long time. We might go on a vacation together. Only the two of us. I hid my fear as soon as it erupted in my chest. That is a wonderful idea. John extended his arm and laid his hand on top of mine. It seemed cozy and familiar, yet it failed to inspire me. Unlike the effect that Ethan's touch produced. It was true, and I despised myself for thinking it. I was left home alone the following morning because John had errands to run. I vowed to myself that I would refrain from doing it, that I would not consider Ethan, and that I would not seek him out. I was already in motion when I heard the creak of the gate opening. My thinking couldn't keep up. As soon as I stepped outside, Ethan, who was standing by the pool, locked eyes with me. After 2 weeks of dormancy, the tension sprang forth with a thud and an indisputable presence. Amazed to see my face? With a hushed voice, he asked. Hardly did I swallow. I considered. I believed we had reached a consensus. It was us. With an intimidating presence, he advanced toward her. Also, I've been attempting to avoid it, but I'm starting to doubt my ability to do so. Breathing became difficult for me. Ethan? The urgency in his voice betrayed his knowledge that you were feeling it as well. Please disprove my claim. I ought to have. It would have been better if I had informed him that I loved my husband, and that I wasn't this woman, that this was a mistake. He wasn't incorrect, therefore I refrained from doing so. I blinked briefly, then opened them and walked over to him. Even if I didn't sound persuasive, I murmured that you needed to depart. Ethan clenched his jaw. Be sincere when you say it. It was too much for me to handle. Suddenly, John's vehicle came into the driveway, as if destiny had taken a hand. I attempted to come up with an explanation for why I was standing so near to the pool guy, why my breath was shallow, and why guilt was visible on my face, but my thoughts were racing and my pulse was pounding. My eyesight became blurry as I turned so quickly. To his credit, Ethan wasted no time repositioning himself, grabbing his tools, and stepping into his proper duty. I couldn't help but crack a smile as John strode through the back door. I spoke with an artificially light voice, expressing my surprise at your rapid return. There was good traffic. With a little narrowing of his eyes, John glanced between Ethan and myself. Is everything okay? The whole time he was talking, Ethan hardly looked across at me. My work is coming to a close, Mr. Parker. There has been no hiccup whatsoever. John appeared content as he nodded. Great, great. Please accept my utmost gratitude. The pressure in my chest was so great that I could not breathe till Ethan had left. But when my attention shifted back to John, I noticed a look on his face that sent shivers down my spine. Persistent uncertainty. Even though he hadn't shown any signs of suspicion just yet, I was most frightened by the fact that something about him was changing. A shift had occurred in the home's atmosphere. As soon as John returned home that night, I could sense it. His stare lingered longer than normal, and his chats were characterized by more deliberate pauses. All of this changed when he saw me. I tried to convince myself that the knot in my gut was imaginary every time he gave me that look. However, I had an intuition that it wasn't. As I lay in bed next to him that night, my body tensed. Finally, John spoke. You seem to be missing something recently. The words caused my heart rate to increase. I rolled onto my side to avoid meeting his eyes and stifled a laugh. It has been a lot, as I mentioned before. At home, in a rut. John hesitated before speaking. The long period of quiet choked. Me. It's more than that. Maintaining a steady breath, I forced myself to swallow. Can you explain? You have no idea. He spoke slowly and measuredly. You're not really here, although it feels like that. It seems as if your thoughts are elsewhere. On their own or in a relationship. My pulse had almost halted. In an effort to escape this talk, I clenched my fists around the covers. I asserted with a calm voice that is absurd. I've simply been exhausted. I briefly worried that John may press on. Then he sighed. However, he subsequently rolled onto his back and gazed up at the ceiling. I simply longed for the days when everything was the way it was. My eyes were tightly closed. Just like you, I did it. But I had a feeling they were never going to be. As I went about my day the following day, pretending everything was all right, John stayed home for the majority of it, making calls from his office. But there was something off about this. With my anxiety levels skyrocketing, I jumped at the slightest sound. My heart sank as I recognized the sound of the back gate creaking. With my pulse racing, I dashed to the window. As he stood beside the pool, Ethan surveyed the mansion. Something went wrong with my tummy. He was wrong to show up today. Especially while John was at home. I sprinted to the back door and slipped out of there before John could even notice. Why are you in this place? Stepping closer to him, I let out a hiss. As Ethan took me in, a shadow fell across his face. A visit with you is vital. You shouldn't be here. Dwelling place of John. Sure, I am aware. He spoke more quietly this time. Trouble is, you've been dodging my advances for some time now. I wanted to know our current situation. Crossing my arms across my chest, I felt a shiver run down my spine. This was discussed with you. We insisted it should end. If that's the case, why do you appear to be opposed to it? He moved closer, whispering. I despised how he could read my mind so well, how he could disregard my excuses and get to the bottom of things I was trying to hide. Just as I was about to reply, the sliding glass door at my rear moved. When I turned around to saw John standing there, staring at us through the glass, a knot formed in my gut. Even though I couldn't read his face, I could feel the strain in his jaw and the tightness in his hands. Someone had caught me. Ethan retreated, his expression becoming more serious, so he must have known as well. Nothing escaped my lips even though I opened them. Both John and his words remained motionless. Everything was going to shift, and I could feel it in the heaviness of the silence. A dense and stifling silence enveloped us as we stood apart. John stared intently into my eyes as he searched for an explanation that I was unable to provide. I was gasping for air and trying to come up with an explanation, but nothing came to mind. While remaining calm and collected, Ethan moved to be by my side. When he did speak, John's voice was serene. For how much time? I was not frightened by fury. The calm authority he exuded was palpable. Hey, John. Be truthful with me. He warned in a more severe tone. For how much time? Hardly did I swallow. This isn't how you perceive it. Never the case. With his hands clenched at his sides, he formed a harsh line with his lips. It seemed like you were planning to let me act foolishly by pretending everything was normal while I sat there. Stop, John. With a forceful exhalation, he shook his head. I require your word on the matter. Bethan took the lead. Doing so was incorrect. I could make out the stress beneath his calm speech. The event has concluded. John grinned bitterly. Was it an error? Well, that's really lavish. His eyes returned to mine. You? Have you something to say? Throat felt parched. Nothing I could think of to say would matter. This was never my intention. The fact remains, nevertheless. With a tight jaw and an angry tone, John spoke. What comes next? The next step is what? He appeared to be trying to put some space between us as he stepped back and shook his head. Seeing you makes me sick to my stomach. My heart raced with fear. Excuse me, John. Please, don't. Uneven breathing, he raised a hand. I must ponder this. This is not the place for me. A stab of agony shot through me at the finality of his voice. It was obvious to both of us that I had damaged something irreparable. Slamming the door behind him, John turned and strode back inside. I recoiled in response to the noise, the impact of the recent events sinking into my very being. Ethan sighed deeply. Go, I should. Unable to meet his gaze, I nodded indifferently. Yeah. His withdrawal was audible to me as I heard the gate click shut in his wake. I found me all by myself. Upon entering the house, I noticed a complete lack of sound. On the counter, John's keys were no longer visible. I took a look at the driveway. It appeared as though his vehicle had vanished. My head was a jumble from everything that had transpired, so I collapsed into the couch and stared at nothing. I had fooled myself into thinking that I could maintain a wall between the two worlds, that I could have it both ways. However, I had finally been hit by reality. Time slipped away. As soon as I heard John's vehicle pull into the driveway, I knew it was after dark. As I stood there, ready, my heart raced. He went inside as soon as the door swung open. His stance was rigid, and his face was unreadable. With a final glance in my direction, he shut the door behind him. It is imperative that we have a conversation. Nodding, my throat constricted. Sure, I am aware. With a palm over his face, John rubbed out an exhalation. I am completely at a loss for words. Hardly did I swallow. Your pain was never my intention. Yes, you did. He spoke in a monotone. I believed in your abilities. This was all only a temporary setback, I thought. We could fix it, I thought. My eyes welled up with tears. Likewise, I had that same thought. He gave me a lengthy look before finally shaking his head. This is getting too much for me. My heart sank. Hey, John. No. Heavy breathing escaped him. Give me some space. Perhaps quite a bit. My throat tightened with anguish. Then are you going? He paused. You have no idea. Compared to a yes, that response wounded more. Once again, he reached for his keys. Tonight, I intend to make my home at a motel. At this very moment, I am unable to be here. Tears streaming down my face, I slowly nodded. Sorry a lot. That evening, John's face first became more amiable. Yes, I also. Without saying a word, he departed. His return would be different this time, I could tell. The weight of my decisions finally hit me as I sat in the stillness. I had misplaced him. Not necessarily for all time, but long enough to realize that things would never be the same again.